Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Fearless Floyd Show. As always, I am your host, Fearless Floyd. Today, we're going to talk about the Freedom of Information Act, which deals with a information request on the federal level, not the state, county, or local level. So that's all we're dealing with here is the federal level. I'm going to play a video for you guys so y'all can hear it. So just stay tuned. I'm going to adjust everything for you guys and get us rolling.
Yeah, going back to the federal FOIA, courts have summarized the purpose and importance by saying the basic purpose of FOIA is to ensure an informed citizenry vital to the functioning of a democratic society, needed to check against the corruption and to hold the government accountable to the governed. And so basically, it's a tool for everyone, activists, bloggers, independent journalists, corporate media organizations, and it allows people to obtain records. It doesn't force the government to create records. So that's a big problem that a lot of requesters have. They want the government to compile a record that shows such and such. Well, the FOIA is not meant to do that. It can get you emails, it can get you reports, memos, audio and video recordings, and PowerPoint slides, you name it. But those records have to already exist. They won't be created for you. The one caveat to that is that they are obligated to extract and compile records from a larger digital database. There was a recent amendment that now makes that an obligation for agencies to comply with. And so they might create a spreadsheet of a particular data set pulled from a larger data set. And that is, in a sense, creating a record, but not really. Those records already exist. They're just kind of reformulating the maybe Excel spreadsheet or other database to pull out that data.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. So it does have to be, in other words, if you're going to ask for something extra, it does have to be digital in some sense. And the reason I'm asking this, let me just give you the background for this. One of the things we tried to get once was the number of DACA applicants who used translators to file their applications. And there's actually a box on the paper application that says, this was an interpreter and you wrote the interpreter's name and everything. And what I was told was, and this was just me talking to somebody high up in USCIS, was that data exists in 800,000 pieces of paper, but was never compiled. In other words, they themselves don't know what share of people use those because they never recorded the data digitally. Is that the kind of thing that would not be covered by FOIA?
Yeah, that's a great example, actually. That would require them to go into each of these different PDFs or whatever files they have. They didn't compile it themselves.
Right.
And so now you're asking them to go through and give us a percentage of these people. And they're not required by law to do that. If they have already done that, if their data system already has that and they have some way to manipulate that data to then extract it, then they are forced to. That's actually a fantastic example of kind of the nuance of how that works and may not work.
So, how do you do that? Well, if somebody wanted to file a FOIA request, what do they do? How do they ask for it? Who do they send it to, et cetera?
Sure. Yeah. So generally speaking, there's kind of 6 phases to the FOIA administrative process. The first phase is the agency's receipt of the request. And depending on the agency you're targeting, you should go to their website and ask, how to submit a request to CBP or whatever the agency you're wanting. And they're going to give you probably 3 different options. You can either email it to you or email it to the agency. You can snail mail it to the agency, or you can use a special internet FOIA portal, which requires you to sign up and kind of create a username and password. And oftentimes you have to provide an email address and maybe a physical address, which sometimes people find intrusive. So maybe you prefer to do snail mail, but I prefer either an email or using the internet portals to get records. And there again, you have to check with the agency of which method that they require.
Mm-hmm.
And the important part of this step is the date that the agency receives the receipt of the request. And the reason that is because the agency under law has 20 or 30 business days to comply with your request. And comply with your request means that they are giving you a determination saying, yes, we received your request and we are going to fulfill that request. There is a misunderstanding that people think that they are entitled to get the actual records within 20 or 30 days. And that's not the case. If you can imagine, some of these things it takes 10,000 pages to fulfill your request.
Sure.
That's not going to be impossible to create in 20, 30 days. But they do have to say, hey, we have your request and we plan to fulfill it. That is their legal obligation, the 20, 30 days. And believe it or not, they have a hard time even complying with those 20 and 30 days. So it's really important to keep your receipt because there are certain privileges you get if they violate that. The first privilege is that you can sue. You can sue the agency immediately after those. On the 21st day you set your reminder, they didn't even reply at all. They gave you no response. You can sue.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, a great story just recently, CIS just filed a lawsuit against CBP for violating FOIA time limits. They never provided us any response to one of our requests. This request was seeking the nationalities of and other information regarding people that CBP caught crossing the border illegally and who were also identified to be on the terrorist watch list. And so we thought it was probably pretty important for the public to know these days with the heightened security threats we're facing.
Right.
That what nationalities are these people coming across? Well, CBP didn't respond at all. And so, CIS wanted to waste no time in enforcing the agency to comply with these obligations. And so we sued. And so you can do that within that 20 or 30 day time period, but you also have to prove to the court that, you have proof of when that request was submitted and received by the agency, because that's when that time clock starts. It is true that when you do sue, you actually do end up getting records faster much of the time, especially for complex FOIA requests. But, it is expensive process to do. And you should, before you sue and before you do that, I did, and I recommend others, reach out to the agency. Hey, what's the deal with my request?
Right.
After the 20 or 30 days, it's a great procedure to reach out to them and ask them for an estimated completion date. Under FOIA, they're required to provide you with an estimated completion date if upon request. And so after those 20 or 30 days are up, it's a great policy just for yourself to check in with the agency, ask them, hey, can you provide that? And there again, if they ghost you again, that's a good sign that they're kind of just planning to process your FOIA request, or there might be something wrong.
Interesting. So I have just a couple of questions. First of all, I don't get into too much detail, but why is it 20 or 30 days? Is it different depending on the kind of the request or the
Yeah, thanks. 20 days is the requirement under FOIA, but they do provide for an exception for unusual circumstances.
Right.
So in unusual circumstances, they allow you to do 30 days. And most of the time, and I don't know, it's no longer unusual circumstances. It's usually just unusual circumstances because in almost every acknowledgement letter you get back says, hey, there's unusual circumstances.
Yeah, right.
We need 30 days.
Right.
So it's kind of it's the more standard one now, but that is the reason. I forgot to mention that the other privilege you get besides being able to sue is that once that time limit is violated, you have the ability to waive either all or some of the processing fees. So as one of the incentives for agencies to process your request on time is that they will be able to accrue fees for processing it. If they don't, then the requester gets to bypass those fees in some cases. So that's another reason to make sure that you keep your records about when that was actually received so you can potentially later on get your waiver of fees.
My other question, and maybe you're going to get into this, but the crafting the request itself is pretty important, because if you ask for, in other words, you can't just say, hey, why don't you give me some info about X, Y, and Z? You need to be able to say, I need this record about this from this date. In other words, the more specific you are, the more likely you are to actually get what you want. Isn't that correct?
Totally. And there is a different phase. I'll talk about that more, but people are very eager often to get a request out really quickly. And let's get this request out. But it actually slows the process down if you don't submit a well-crafted request. It pays dividends to do a lot of research in the beginning to craft the phrasing that you're asking for really well, to target not just a broad agency like DHS in general, but fine-tune that request to submit it to maybe one of their sub-agencies. And even within their sub-agencies, try to target a few offices or subdivisions of that agency to target with your request. And that will increase your chances of having a successful processing of your request. And a lot of people try to fast track that, but I'll talk that more in kind of the phase 3, which is perfecting the request, which we'll get more into the legal restrictions.
Sure. Go ahead.
After the first phase, the second phase is the agency's acknowledgement of the request. And this is usually in the form of a formal acknowledgement letter. And this letter will oftentimes provide you with a specific tracking number. And once you get this tracking number, every communication that you have with the request, including that estimated completion date that I mentioned earlier, should include this tracking number. If it doesn't, then it effectively says that communication doesn't exist.
Interesting.
So it's really important that every communication has that tracking number. This letter might also determine whether or not they are accepting and willing to process your FOIA request, kind of their obligations under that 20 or 30-day rule. It may also determine in that letter, which it often does, whether there are unusual circumstances requiring that 30-day limit opposed to the 20-day limit. And it also, in that letter, will probably determine if you requested a fee waiver or expedited processing. It will determine whether you were approved or denied. And at that point, anytime you get any denial, you need to appeal within 90 days. And that is actual days. Unlike the 20 or 30-day time limit that I've been mentioning all along here, that's actually 20 business days or 30 business days. Your days to appeal are 90 days, and that is strict day count, not business days.
Right. Okay.
And so then to phase 3, and this is where, yeah, you were mentioning, this is probably the most important phase. And it doesn't have to be. If you did a bunch of work before you submitted your request, you might be fine. But this is where a lot of requests go to die, unfortunately. It's kind of where agencies kind of shit test the requester to determine if they really have what it takes to get the records. So a request must be, quote unquote, reasonably described. And what this means under law is a FOIA request must describe the records it seeks with enough detail to enable an agency employee familiar with the subject matter to locate the records with a reasonable amount of effort. And as you can imagine, the standard is kind of highly subjective. And because of this, it's used kind of to weed out a lot of non-serious requesters. People get their response back saying, oh, this request is too broad, or you have not reasonably described as closed. And a lot of people give up there. That's just, that's just the end of the line. They don't understand the process. And so it's just done. And the agency can kind of weed out a lot of these requests. And to be fair to the agency, a lot of amateur requesters are submitting pretty poorly written requests. They get a lot of them per day, and there has to be some process to kind of weed out some of these. But I've submitted, of course, I've submitted perfect requests, and they get lumped into this category of not reasonably described. And then there again, that's an adverse determination. Once you get that decision, you have 90 days to appeal it, and you should if you believe it was reasonably described.
So basically, that step is a way for the bureaucracy, if they don't want to give you the information, to create problems for you and hope you go away, basically.
Totally. Each one of these phases is another phase where they can have that opportunity to, if they don't like your request, or they think that request is going to shed some bad light on them, they might do that. That's kind of a dark way to look at the agencies, but it definitely appears to be that way in some of these cases when, they perfectly responded to this request, and this request is fine, but this other request, which you submitted way before the other request, they're not even touching it.
Interesting.
So when a request is determined to be not reasonably described, there's several things that can happen depending on the agency. Under FOIA allows agencies to write their own regulations under FOIA. So they have to abide by FOIA, but they can write their own regulations, kind of fine-tuning how they abide by FOIA.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is where it kind of varies. So one response you might get is that the request will be immediately closed. They'll get a letter to you saying, your request is not reasonably described. It doesn't follow the guidelines of FOIA. We have administrative close your request. And then they should give you your rights of appeal, and then you can appeal that. FBI is known to do this. ICE is known to do this. A lot of agencies, they have no obligations to work with you to fine-tune your request. They'll just close it down immediately. A story about this, just the other day, CIS, we had to appeal FBI's determination that one of our requests was not reasonably described. And there again, it was just a letter like that. Not reasonably described is closed. And this request was identical to the one we sent to CBP regarding the nationalities of those apprehended at the border who were on the terrorist watch list.
Mm-hmm.
And there again, it's one of those they probably don't want to produce that information for one reason or another. And so this is kind of a tactic showing that, you try again, or giving us kind of that shit test of whether or not we're serious about getting these records. And we appealed, and depending on their denial or acceptance, we might have to go to court on that one as well. The other response that you might get there are other agencies that are more friendly in terms of their federal regulations requiring them to work with the requester to kind of work out the kinks to make it reasonably described. So HHS and FDA, they're known to kind of have more back and forth with the requester.
Interesting.
They might send you a modification request, or a modification request would be, we want you to actually narrow the scope. You're actually going to change the scope a little bit. Instead of like, the request is for a 4-year span, you might narrow it to a 2-year span.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a modification. And they might send you that, or they might send you a clarification notice saying, all right, we don't fully understand what records you're asking for. Can you please provide us a little bit more details about this or that? And so they're trying to work with you. But there are a few ways that they use this there again, that maybe to delay things or to maybe create some other problems. When you get these letters, that 20 or 30-day time limit we talked about earlier, that is now paused. So if you're on your 15th day of your time limit and you're eager to sue on this, and they send you a clarification letter and you forget about it for a year or 6 months or whatever, your request is dead in the water until you respond, and the agency has no obligation to continuing to contact you.
Interesting.
So it will just sit there, and your opportunity to get those records is now dead until you respond. The other one that they might do is they'll send you one of these clarification or modification letters, but they'll put a 10 or 20 or 30-day time limit for you to respond. And if you don't respond, they'll say they'll administratively close a request. And so if you can imagine, they get 100 requests in one day, and they send out to each of those requesters, say, you have 10 days to respond to this inquiry for clarification. You can imagine 20% of those are not going to be able to respond in 20 days or those 10 days. And they just cut out, 20% of those ones that they have to process. So it's kind of a tool for them to put then a shot clock back on the requester. And they're going to just kind of testing them to see if they're serious or organized enough to respond to the request.
Interesting. So what's the next phase?
Well, there is more phases, but there's this one, because it's so important. There's a few, there's a couple other things to talk about.
Go ahead.
About this phase, because what we talked about now is just simply whether or not it's reasonably described. But even when you reasonably describe the records, it doesn't necessarily fulfill this reasonably described standard, because then the agency has to determine whether they can process that information within a reasonable amount of time. And they'll determine your request. If it takes them too long to locate or process these records, they'll say it's overly burdensome or overly broad request. And if you get this determination, everyone should know that the agency bears a burden to provide a sufficient explanation as to why they determined your request overly broad or overly burdensome. So you can put the onus on them. Most of the times they'll give you a letter saying, oh, it's just overly broad. You should email them and say, you need to explain why. And if they don't, you should probably put in your appeal that they failed to bear their burden to provide a sufficient explanation as why that was overly burdensome or overly broad. And in my experience, I generally look for two things when an agency has determined one of my requests to be overly burdensome or overly broad. And that is, I want them to have shown in some way that they actually conducted a preliminary search, maybe not a full search, but at least a preliminary search to show that they know what they're talking about. They didn't just take one glance at this thing and just determine that it is overly broad, that they might have, they dug into some records or actually conducted a preliminary search. The other thing that I'm looking for is some type of quantifier to back up their decision, either numbers or facts. For example, if they say, our preliminary search showed that we found 10,000 responsive pages of records, that's a lot of records to process. And it's not impossible. It doesn't for sure mean it's overly broad. I've seen cases where the government was forced to produce millions of documents, and that was for FDA's approval of the Pfizer COVID vaccine. Someone FOIA'd for that information, and the government had to give up millions. So the number doesn't necessarily mean, but generally, for most requests, if it's over 10,000 pages, that is probably overly broad. Another one that you might get is like, hey, your request is going to require us to search 70 agency personnel's emails for your specific terms. That's a lot of people to search. You might want to think about narrowing it. And even for the 10,000 page, does the average requester want to sift through 10,000 pages of documents to find the needle in the haystack? So I think it's in everyone's benefit to kind of narrow it as much as possible. Don't play games here unless you have to. The other thing about getting 10,000 pages of records is that even in litigations, courts will limit the agency's requirement to produce records to about 500 pages a month. So the best at math, but that would take a long time to get those 10,000 pages. And so if you're eager to get these pages quickly or your documents quickly, it's best to narrow it as much as you can do. And that goes back to really in the beginning, thinking about your request and doing research. A great research step to do is, look up the organizational charts for the agency you're targeting. And if you go online and type that in, every organization has those organizational charts, and you can look at all the subdivisions and sometimes even the personnel in those subdivisions. And some of them have their titles, their employment titles. And that's a great way to kind of fine tune your request to narrow it as much as possible. And you can send multiple requests, so you can target different folks for different concepts and kind of break up your request into a few different ones. And that sometimes makes it easier to process.
Interesting. And basically more likely that they'll comply with it and less likely that they'll cause you problems, basically.
Exactly. I mean, yeah, the problems aren't fun for anybody. So if you can do your part to narrow it as much as possible, that's a great way to do it.
Okay.
So that's the third phase. And that's a big one. Like I said, a big one where a lot of them go to die. The fourth phase is pretty simple. This is the agency's search for responsive records. So after it's perfected, that's when they conduct their real search. They might do a preliminary search in that third phase, but in this fourth phase, they know it. The request is perfected, and now they're searching for records. The only thing I'll mention in this one is about fees, processing fees, and reviewing fees. It may have been determined in the last phase or this phase that there are certain costs established with researching, reviewing, and producing these records, and this can sometimes be used to effectively deny requests. So I've seen agency estimates for processing records up to $30,000. And, for the average requester, that's not possible. So as soon as you get that request for those fees, you're just kind of dead in the water. You're not going to be able to pay that. And so they're not going to fulfill your request. One way around this is media organizations and academic and scientific institutions. They can ask for fee waiver requests to waive all these fees or a good portion of these fees. And so Center for Immigration Studies does this. And one thing that the common requester can do, maybe the blogger, is that if they have a great FOIA request that they're eager about getting and they think it's going to get some good information, they can seek out some organization that either nonprofit or for-profit or academic or scientific, and seek out someone in that institution and say, hey, can we submit this request on your behalf? And that way we can then put in a fee waiver request and you can get around these fees. And so I'll talk about this later, but Center for Immigration Studies is actively looking for whistleblowers and border informants that may have information. And we can use FOIA with them to collaborate their findings. And we can oftentimes get these fees waived because of our status as a representative of the news media. And there again, if you request that and it gets denied, you have to appeal 90 days after that decision. And if you don't, by the end, when they produce these records and say, hey, or they won't produce them yet, but they'll say, hey, you have to pay these fees and you're not comfortable with those fees. Well, you already passed your opportunity to appeal the fee waiver. So anytime you get those adverse decisions, definitely appeal.
Right.
The fifth phase is the agency then processes the records. So they find all the records. Now they are processing them. What that means is that they are reviewing the records to redact ones that fall under one of the 9 FOIA exemptions. And so if you can imagine, if you're going through 10,000 emails, that review person has to review every line, every email to determine if it's personal information, whether it's a threat to national security, whether it's a deliberative process. And so it takes a long time to go through these records. And that's where a bulk of the time is spent.
Interesting.
On processing these requests, is reviewing the materials and redacting this information. I'm not going to go into all the different exemptions because there's 9 of them and it could take up a whole podcast in itself, but I will direct people to a great resource. If they went to any search engine and typed in Department of Justice Guide to the Freedom of Information Act, they break down each one of these exemptions and they actually provide case law and the contours and scope of each of these FOIA exemptions. And it should provide even the novice with kind of expert level knowledge of how to fight or determine whether these exemptions used in their productions were accurate or not.
Right.
So the sixth phase, the final phase, and remember, this is just the administrative process. After the administrative process and after you appeal, or if you choose to appeal, then you can go to court, which is a whole nother process. But this is the 6 phases of the administrative process. So the 6th phase is kind of the agency has reviewed the documents and now they're going to release them. And Now the requester reviews the responsive records. And in your initial request, I always specifically ask the agency to produce my records in digital format. This usually saves time because they don't have to print out all these records, and it also saves money. Some people get a disk. I rather them just email me a large PDF or zip file to my email. I think it's faster. So I would do that in your request. The requester should then review the materials to determine if there are any reasons to appeal. You have 90 days of the date of receipt of those productions to do so. A few reasons that you might appeal are the adequacy of the search. And this means that you have reasons to believe that there are responsive records that are missing or have been unreasonably overlooked during the search. So if you requested emails from, say, 2021 to 2023, and you're reviewing all the emails and you don't see any from 2021, well, that's a good sign that they probably misread or mistook your request and failed to search for or include any of those records from 2021. And you could put that summary into your appeal and appeal that determination that they produced all the records that they had to. Another reason to appeal would be that you looked over their redactions and you believe that there are improper redactions that don't fit the exemption claimed. So an example of this is one of our recent lawsuits against CBP. We wanted to know the different airports that illegal immigrants were flying into using the CBP One app to obtain humanitarian parole and potentially future asylum claims. This information we believe to be helpful to the public to inform different states and community, like who might be most burdened by the sudden influx of these illegal immigrants into their communities. And so if you can imagine, right now, New York City and Chicago are being inundated with a lot of illegal immigrants. And if we could find that how many people are flying actually into the airports, not only just bust in, but how many are being flown into the airports, we could kind of show how severe the strain is on those communities. In fact, there was a recent report, Todd Bensman reported that a few of these airports from this data that we got received over 30,000 illegal immigrants during this year alone. And so when we got that data, all the airports, they showed us there were 42 different airports, and they showed us how many number were coming in each of those airports, but they redacted the different names of those airports. So we couldn't tell whether it was Chicago or whether it was New York City. And they redacted them under Exemption 7E. And their argument was that this protects law enforcement techniques and procedures. And we're looking at these. We still to this day don't fully understand how these are techniques and procedures by redacting just the airports. These are public areas,
right,
that these people are flying into. How that really falls under 7E. So we're going to challenge that, and that doesn't seem to fit. And maybe they'll fully justify it, but we're going to challenge it. And that'd be something that the common requester should do. Is, does it make sense? Look at that guide that I told you to seek out on the DOJ's website and see if it really fits, and then target that. The other big one that people can challenge is whether or not the agency reasonably segregated non-exempt records from exempt records. And what this means is that they have an obligation to, if there's a long string of emails and one of those emails has information that might be of national security, they can redact that little piece of information, but they can't redact the entire email.
Interesting.
They have to produce all records that are not exempt, and they can only redact ones that are exempt. And so if you ever see like large blocks of redacted items in the productions, chances are you could go back to them and say, hey, these are not reasonably segregated. You need to reasonably segregate the non-exempt portions of the exempt records, and we want to see what they're talking about. And oftentimes they'll have to do that. One caveat to that is for drafts. That's where I oftentimes see the most just block redactions that I can't really challenge. Drafts are under Exemption 5, kind of deliberative process privilege, and drafts you oftentimes can't get, and they'll fully redact them because of various reasons.
Sure.
But
interesting.
But for emails, you should see most of the email. You should see kind of who's being sent to, the subject matter, different attachments. They can't just block out everything, and sometimes they attempt that.
Right.
So there again, you need to appeal any of these decisions within 90 days of that of getting those records.
So basically, I mean, what you're described sounds really kind of like a cat and mouse game. You know what I mean? In other words, they're trying to avoid being pinned down, and you're, with increasing specificity, trying to pin them down. I mean, again, maybe I have a sort of jaundiced view, but it seems to me that, generally speaking, if they wanted to release data, they'd be releasing it. And if they aren't, it's because they would rather not. And so trying to, come up with roadblocks and obstructions that will make you go away at some point, it seems to me is something that the bureaucracy is definitely going to want to do.
Yeah, I think the cat and mouse game, that's definitely the way I sense it going down. And it is amazing how some requests just so flawlessly go through, and clearly there wasn't a care in the world for it. And then other requests that are very similar, but maybe in a different political matter, somehow get caught at every level.
Right.
And so it is a big cat and mouse game, and people should just enjoy the ride and definitely push back and have,
right,
have fun at it. But it does require a lot of back and forth, and it's not just a simple thing to do. But I will say that the federal government is pretty good at providing the public with enough resources to be able to navigate this process on their own, at least the administrative phase. It gets a little definitely trickier at the judicial review phase, but there's enough resources out there that people can do their own appeals if you read that resource guide and take the time to do it. And I suggest people, challenge it. You get those records of public interest, and take this opportunity and your right to get these records.
And, and this is something you mentioned at the beginning. If all of that is not something that you're qualified or prepared or inclined to do, but that you do have an idea or you do have information about a specific document, say, that is somewhere in the government's, in that big warehouse from Indiana Jones, where the Ark of the Covenant is, if you get the movie reference, but you're not prepared to do all of this, we actually can potentially take this on ourselves. And we have a button on our website, a big red lurid button that you can click on to take you to a page where we have a secure email address if you have information for us to pursue this kind of thing, rather than the individual having to do it. If you could just tell us a little bit about that whistleblower thing.
We are seeking out people, either border informants or whistleblowers, that have information on the failures of U.S. immigration policies, the willful neglect of agency responsibilities, the fraud, waste, and abuse of government resources, the scope of the human trafficking crisis, the economic burden on states and municipalities, abuses of immigration policies and programs, or other harms by illegal or legal immigration crisis. If you have insider knowledge or knowledge about it, yes, go to that big red button at the CIS.org website on the top right corner and click that and follow the directions there, and give us a little synopsis of the information you have, and we can help corroborate that information by using FOIA. If you have that information, we can then get those records to kind of prove it. We can also keep your identity anonymous if you so choose to. And we also at the CIS have a capacity we are a media organization that can get this out there to the eyes of many people. And we also have many connections in DC and with policymakers to actually create some effective change. And so if people have this information, we're not interested in the illegal immigrant next door who plays his music very loud,
right,
or not,
exactly.
or mows his lawn early. We're not interested in that. But if you have like kind of that list of things I just mentioned, information on those topics, we do want to hear about it. And those are the types of things that can really effectuate change. So we have created this opportunity that people can outreach to us, and we're happy to work with them to get information that will generally make our immigration system better.
And just to wrap up, just to sort of tie a bow on that, this also would apply, as we suggested, calling it a whistleblower thing, potentially, if you are in one of these agencies, and there is information that you think should get out, but you're not in a position to make sure it gets out, you can confidentially contact us. And if you're able to provide a very specific description of what the information is that we can request, we can be a conduit basically to get stuff out in the light of day that a government employee might not be able to be in a position to do on his own. Either legally may not be allowed to do it, but he can tell us confidentially and we can request it and try to get that stuff out into the public.
Totally. Yeah. And the type of information that'd be really helpful would be like a name of a report that you saw,
right,
or a certain memo that some agent saw, or you work in a specific subdivision of a general agency, or you know a certain personnel that write really sloppy emails detailing all sorts of juicy stuff that the public should know. I mean, if you tell us the time frames for those things and where we should search, that gives us the best opportunity to get those records, and we can get it through legal means and no risk to the whistleblower. So yeah, we do have an encrypted email that you can contact us. That is borderinformant@protonmail.com. Or maybe easier step is just to find that link on the CIS.org website at the top right corner, the big red button.
So we have a whole bunch of requests, right? I don't want to go into detail. Like I said, we're running long here, but we have dozens of FOIA requests that are pending, don't we?
Yeah, we are over 100 FOIA requests and got a bunch of appeals in, and we're litigating the ones we have to. The last couple of weeks, we filed 2 more litigations, and so we're actively getting this information and forcing agencies to comply with their obligations of FOIA. And there's no more important time to get this data, especially when the crisis is just heating up. So
just as
And there you have it. And that's the recording. It's actually a video, but there's no video for that particular media. It's all audio, nothing but a thumbnail like you see behind me. So that concludes the FOIA video information. I hope it helped you. I hope it gave you some resources. I hope it gave you a little whoopee cushion under your butt to get motivated and start filing your FOIAs and open records requests with the state and local authorities to get whatever information you need. And if you like this video, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share, hit that notification bell, leave a comment below. And I encourage you all to share these videos, okay? Share them with your friends and family, your coworkers, Facebook, Instagram, all that. You want to reach me, The Fearless Floyd Show at yahoo.com. I'm The Fearless Floyd Show on almost every platform out there. Mainly on Telegram. FearlessFloydShow.com is my website. I'm getting ready to run Black Friday specials on LeFlore's On Trust eBooks, softcover books, combo, and classes. And we're also going to do a live class, a special one-off fundamental trust class. You guys who don't have your trust, I am going to personally conduct the class at the beginning, and we're going to walk through and create your trust for you. Absolutely. So you will have it down, and then we will bring Ann on for about an hour to do some questions and answers. But I will be following her format, her template, her book. So like, subscribe, share, hit that notification bell, please. And share this with everybody. I hope this was very informative for you. Y'all have a safe and happy weekend. Holiday coming up. Thanksgiving. Bing. There you go. Gobble, gobble, gobble. Be thankful for everything you have. All I can say. Peace in the Middle East.